So the Atari 2600 could only natively support games that had up to 4 kilobytes of ROM space. However, in 1981, with the success of the arcade game Asteroids, Atari utilized a technique called bank switching, which allowed the Atari 2600 port to contain 8 kilobytes of ROM space. With this new way of making bigger games, we would see 16 kilobyte games, a 32 kilobyte game, and even a 64 kilobyte game. So what game was it, and why did it need 64 kilobytes of ROM space? Well, let's take a look. What's going on, guys? It's Podrez, coming at you with another video. So we're going to be talking about the biggest Atari 2600 game ever released, but first, I now have merch. Right now I'm offering t-shirts, coffee mugs, face masks, and more. The t-shirt's actually been selling pretty decently, so if you want to pick one of these up, just go straight to shop.podrez.net. Secondly, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button right there. It only takes a second, but it helps the channel grow. Anyway, we're not going to waste any time. Let's get right to the video.
One more thing, it's got a special low price, under 50 bucks. 50 bucks? Now isn't that nice? The fun is back, oh yes siree. It's the 2600 from Atari.
When the 2600 was released, Atari prioritized bringing over some of their arcade titles to this brand new console, as well as some original titles that were basic in nature. Not much of a standard had been set yet, therefore a lot of these games were very basic. The Atari 2600 was only capable of reading 4 kilobytes of ROM space on a cartridge, so if a company made a game that was 8 kilobytes in size, for example, the console wouldn't be able to read all the data. Now, at the time, this was completely fine. After all, Combat and Street Racer only took up 2 kilobytes each. It seemed like 4 kilobytes was a good stopping point. But Atari's arcade games were becoming more advanced. The game Asteroids was much more complex than its previous games. If this game were to be ported over to the 2600, the developers would need at least 8 kilobytes of ROM space. But how is this possible if the console can't read more than 4 kilobytes? The developers utilized a trick called bank switching. By dividing the 8 kilobytes of ROM space into 2 segments, the 2600 will be able to read each one individually, and then the game can switch between the two if there's data on the other segment that needs to be accessed. This essentially doubled the amount of ROM space the console could work with. Now that the developers have more space to work with, they were able to port Asteroids over to the 2600. This is a very faithful conversion of the arcade original and a very remarkable achievement. Atari didn't stop there though. They would continue releasing 8 kilobyte games, including, but not limited to, Mario Brothers, a decent translation of the arcade original, Gremlins, a strange but really fun and addictive movie-based game, Gravitar, a very well done arcade translation that features 12 levels, Snoopy and the Red Baron, a fun shooter that has nice parallax scrolling, Pigs in Space, a game based on the Muppets that actually contains 3 minigames, Elevator Action, a very impressive arcade port that unfortunately never saw a release, Aquaventure, a fun underwater shooter that also unfortunately didn't see a release, and Crystal Castles, a 16 kilobyte game that is a well done arcade port and somehow managed to cram in 12 levels. By 1985, Atari was put in a really difficult position. With a new console being released in the US, Atari really had to push the console in a direction it had never been before. With the release of the NES, Atari made some changes to the 2600 to beef it up. For one, they released a redesigned model of the 2600 called the Junior. This one was slimmer and looked more modern, but was otherwise the same console. They would air new commercials with a catchy jingle talking about how the fun is back, and they dropped the price of the console from $190 to just $50. But the biggest change was in the games. Knowing what the developers were competing against, these new releases would really push the hardware of the 2600. One of the games was Solaris. This is an impressive looking game that has a surprising amount of detail in the graphics. The 3D perspective is also very ambitious for the 2600. Honestly, this could almost pass for an NES game. There's also Radar Lock, which runs off the same engine as Solaris. Here, you have to destroy all the enemies. I'm actually impressed with what they did here. The rotation effect is really impressive. When you complete a level, you have to line up your aircraft with another one so you can get more fuel. Really impressive that they pulled off this 3D perspective. Can we take a second here and really appreciate that we went from this to this? Both Solaris and Radar Lock were 16 kilobyte games, so at this point, Atari was really trying to get the most out of the console. Another late release was Secret Quest. This was Atari's answer to Legend of Zelda. The developers used creative tactics to make the game longer, like reusing a lot of the same rooms and graphics in order to save on ROM space. As a result, we get a game that has 8 levels, and each of those levels contain dozens of rooms and enemies. So you're definitely getting a lot here. Really impressive that they were able to make this happen with only 16 kilobytes of ROM space. But bigger isn't always better. One of Atari's last releases was Fatal Run, which is their biggest game on the 2600 at a whopping 32 kilobytes of ROM space. To put this size into perspective, some NES games are smaller than this. Popeye and Donkey Kong Jr., for example, only take up 25 kilobytes each. As we can see, we have a nice looking title screen. The game has an interesting storyline. A comet hit the Earth, and as a result, everyone is suffering from radiation poisoning. You must drive from town to town and deliver the vaccine that counteracts it. It's like pole position, but with some upgrades. You have some extra stats you have to worry about, like the engine, tire tread, and fuel. It may seem cool at first that it's a 3D perspective, but pole position already achieved this, and that was only an 8 kilobyte game. So where's the extra 32 kilobytes of ROM space actually being used for? Well, the game has great presentation. For one, the title screen and game over screen are both nice and flashy. Secondly, each level has different graphics of what the town looks like, and the game has a unique message that displays every time you complete a level. All of these things are going to take up a lot of ROM space. Also, the game has numerous levels that are unique to each other, unlike pole position. So you're getting a bit more content here. In between levels, you can refill some of your stats using the currency that you collected. So this is a decent driving game, but it's not perfect. The game doesn't make it very clear what these stats are, and when you're refilling these stats on the menu screen, the game makes no attempt to explain anything to you. What's going on? In general, you really just gotta figure this all out on your own. Also, you would think a game that's 32 kilobytes would mean it's some really impressive achievement, but in reality, it's just pole position with a few extra bells and whistles. Not as impressive of a game as you would expect. So, if you think it's unbelievable that a 32 kilobyte game exists on the Atari 2600, well, we're not done yet. In the early 90s, knockoff consoles and games were becoming very popular in Brazil. One company, Dynacom, had made a few Famicom and Atari 2600 clone consoles, but Dynacom was a little different from the competition as they were trying to make more innovative products. One of them was their portable Atari 2600 called the MegaBoy Compact. It had a similar form factor to the Game Gear. The console was compatible with Atari 2600 games, but it was packaged with a game just called MegaBoy. This right here is the biggest Atari 2600 game ever made, at a whopping 64 kilobytes of ROM space. To put this in perspective, that's more than Super Mario Bros., which is only 41 kilobytes. So it's an educational game. You can do math problems, spell words based on a picture, rearrange words, and play music. There's not much to this, it's just a basic educational game. So why is it 64 kilobytes then? Well, most of that space is used to store the questions. If this game only had 4 or 8 kilobytes, there would probably be like 5 questions, and that probably wouldn't be a very good educational game. So given the fact that this game was only released in a small area and most of the extra space is just storing trivia questions, some people don't count this one and they consider Fatal Run the biggest Atari 2600 game. But if we're just talking about size alone, MegaBoy is the biggest Atari 2600 game ever made. But if we're talking about technical achievements, Solaris, Radar Lock, and Secret Quest are the 3 games that really impressed me, and those were only 16 kilobytes. So size isn't everything. Originally, Atari 2600 games couldn't be more than 4 kilobytes in size because of console limitations, but that was fine at the time because these games were basic. But when Asteroids was ported over to the 2600, they needed more space to work with, so they utilized bank switching in order to effectively have 8 kilobytes of ROM space. But then the NES was released, and Atari needed to find a way to keep their console relevant, so they started releasing games with 16 kilobytes of ROM space like Solaris, Radar Lock, and Secret Quest. While games like Fatal Run and MegaBoy were bigger, it's the former 3 games that were truly remarkable. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.